Thanks, Steve. Morning, everybody. So I'm going to spend a little time talking to you about a term that this probably sounds a little overused these days, lean. If I could get my slides up on the conference monitor, that'd be great. So most of you have probably heard the term lean, and you probably think it's heavily overused. The reality is that lean is only part of a bigger initiative, and many people who embrace concepts like lean startup and so on do so because they want to achieve greater agility. How many people here have heard the term lean startup? How many people here think the word lean is overused? It's okay, put your hands up, I don't mind. So the real question here is your organization agile? We've tried really hard to make our organizations agile. We don't really have a good idea what that means, but there have been tons of technologies and processes and frameworks that we use to try and achieve a degree of leanness in our organization. And the problem with all of these initiatives is that they're part of a much bigger puzzle. So when you try and embrace cloud computing, for example, or agile development, they're part of a much bigger whole. On their own, they don't do that much. Let's look at cloud computing, for example. Cloud computing is, simply put, shared resources that are available elastically, that are sort of virtualized instead of physical. And they're based on one fundamental shift, which is that once upon a time, we assumed that IT was a precious, scarce resource to be protected, which is why we carried punched cards to the basement of a building at 3 in the morning. Today, clouds are in abundance, and I think technology as a whole is in abundance. The cell phone, by the way, today is 40 years old. How many people here are less than a meter away from their mobile device at all times? Studies show that it's over half of you. So cloud is a recognition of the abundance of technology and the shift to a world where technology is easily available. Cloud on its own does not agility make. A second big initiative trying to improve things is called DevOps. DevOps is this idea that you code the infrastructure and the application and the data all at once so that the system can expand and contract. You're essentially writing code not just for the application, but for how it will run, where it will run, and so on. And so DevOps is yet another initiative to try and make the organization more agile. The name Agile Development on its own refers to this idea of coding in very short iterative sprints. You sit down as a scrum, you make a decision, you make some coding, you test to see if you're there yet. And Agile is yet another attempt to make the organization more agile as a whole. And then, of course, Lean Startup. The Lean Startup idea is predicated on a constant cycle of building something that's the minimum thing you need to build to figure out if you're on the right track, measuring whether that was correct or whether you made a horrible mistake, and then learning from that and building something new. It's a constant cycle of iteration. Now, all of these things are not new. I mean, the lean startup stuff borrows on the work of people like Deming and TQM and Six Sigma and simply applies it to early stage companies, although it is finding a home in much bigger organizations. Agile is another example of this. The Agile model is a consequence of what happened after waterfall models didn't work well. And it's led to a much more adaptive, sort of reactive way of coding and anticipating what your market really needs. The DevOps market and tools like Puppet and Chef is really about understanding how to develop code that can sort of self-heal and is resilient and understands the environment in which it's working. And then cloud computing, of course, is just like mainframe 2.0, but a lot of the core technologies, virtualization and so on, are not new. These things on their own are not new. And these things on their own do not make you agile. When we say we want agility, what we mean is we want to change from an organization to an organism. If you think about an organism, when your hand is on a hot plate, you pull it back without even thinking. You just react. You don't want a security silo. You want an immune system that adapts to threats. When your organization becomes an organism, that's when you achieve true agility. Now, there's a very smart guy named Ken Wilber who spends a lot of time thinking about this stuff. He's an integrative philosopher, brilliant guy, and he spends time trying to understand how everything from religions to physics to society come together as a series of components that emerge into larger behavior. So, for example, what he talks about is a holon. And this is actually borrowed from Arthur Koestler, but a holon is a thing that is whole unto itself, but also part of a greater whole. So to Wilber, a letter is part of a word is part of a sentence is part of a paragraph, which is part of a chapter, which is part of a book, which is part of a library. This smaller things becoming bigger things shows up throughout nature. And in many cases, the word subsumes in the face of the sentence and becomes only a part of the sentence. When you're reading the sentence, you're not thinking about the words. You, for example, have a series of holons inside you. Your heart, your lungs, your skin, your nerves. But you don't have to sit there and actively think about making your heart beat faster when you're running. Your body takes care of itself. These components are acting in the service of a greater whole. And even you as a human can sometimes become part of a greater whole. Things like religious ecstasy or raves or standing alone with nature tend to trigger feelings where you are part of something greater. And this is actually a biological reaction. There is strong evolutionary evidence to suggest that it's really good for us to subsume ourselves into part of a greater whole, to defend our tribe from attack, for example, to give ourselves selflessly for the greater good. And you, as a human, are part of a greater whole in moments like these. What we want for the business to move from an organization to an organism is for it to give up its component parts in service of the greater whole. We are building a business organism, and I believe this is what we mean when we use buzzwords like agility. Traditional organizations tend to regulate and delegate and formalize and proceduralize. They are solving for the ability to run at scale. Organisms tend to react, they tend to respond, they tend to learn from their surroundings. They are solving for resiliency, for anti-fragility, for agility. And so the reason your cloud efforts may not be giving you everything you'd hoped is that you haven't really embraced the whole here. You haven't subsumed these holons of lean startup and agile coding into a greater whole. And I'll give you a word like lean IT, but you can call it whatever you want. The bottom line here is that we need to retool the way the business works, because we are rethinking the business in an era of significant change. Every customer channel is becoming a digital channel. Every process is becoming a software process. The technology that underpins both your channel and your internal processes is your technology and your software and your cloud and your infrastructure and so on. Moving to an agile organization is about rebuilding the business now that both the processes you use and the channels with which you connect to customers are based on this abundant technology of cloud computing. And it's not just the computers. What are on-demand shipping companies, if not logistics clouds? They're on-demand, they have an array of services, they often have good APIs, they're billed by consumption, they're elastic. If it weren't for the logos on the left of this slide, you would assume they were clouds. Look at real-time Salesforce automation tools. What are those but ways of controlling your minions out there in the world and getting them to do your bidding? When you can optimize the behavior of a salesperson by telling them on whom to call based on, for example, whether that client or prospect is home because they haven't checked in somewhere at Twitter, which office is closest to them, who's having a good day based on sentiment analysis to be called on next. These are simple forms of making the organism much more reactive. 3D printing is another great example of this. What is 3D printing if not replacing the supply chain and the inventory with data? 3D printing became cool when we stopped using it for prototypes and started using it for the thing itself. If you think where color printers were 20 years ago and where they are today, consider what the world of 3D printing will look like in a very short amount of time. Now, Wilbur tells us there are two things needed for holons to form. The first is that the thing must be whole unto itself. So the heart, for example, must be a complete system. You can't have half a heart. That thing has to work. But the second thing is that there has to be a surrounding system that will support it. So the heart, if it weren't a whole, would fall apart into the cells and tissues that made it up, and it would basically go back into the organization. But also that heart can't function without a respiratory system, a circulatory system, a brain to trigger impulses, a neural system, and so on. It's part of a greater whole. And in the same way, this model of lean IT requires that we add other components. Things like innovation accounting, real-time analytics, risk tolerance, and so on. The move to an organization that thinks in this way, that is truly agile, cannot be done piecemeal because you will not achieve the benefits. And this right here is the real challenge for enterprises trying to adopt agile methods, is that organizations abhor change. Organizations are set up to scale reliably and predictably. I was taught in business school that business has always been about scale, that in the long term, scale is the only sustainable competitive advantage. It allows you to control market pricing, supply and demand, it allows you to get better costs. Those are the things that let you win. And because this was the case for centuries, corporations were the logical consequence of this quest for scale. When you wanted to undertake something huge, you formed a corporation to do it, whether it was a phone company or a transatlantic railroad. Now, until this time, until corporations, the only really big things were done by monarchs. As corporations grew, they realized they needed to find ways to scale everything they did, including the people. And we have this gentleman, Daniel McCallum, to thank for it. Daniel McCallum learned from the war in which he'd fought and applied his learnings to railroads. He found that railroads that had more than 50 miles of track became extremely disorganized. So what he did was assign one person to every 50 miles of track, one person to manage those people, and the railroads scaled. Now, this finding was unusual at the time, but it became so powerful that it formed the basis for most corporations you know, because it gave them predictability and control and scale. It gave them a place for everything they wanted to manage. Here's a typical org chart. Optimized for span, optimized for wide scale, optimized for having a lot of people do things and staying within their boxes. The problem is that this org chart, which looks like most corporations, is the opposite of resiliency and readiness. And lean IT is really a stance, a posture to be in. Let me give you a contrast to that traditional corporate org chart. In Israel, when there is a fight, 85% of the time the commander gets killed. This is Jonathan Netanyahu. He ran the attack on Entebbe, the raid on Entebbe. He was the only victim, and he was the commander. So Jonathan was at the front lines, but the system on which he relied, the way his military command was structured, was optimized for resiliency. And I had a conversation with a technologist in Ottawa a few weeks ago, a guy who used to be in the Israeli army. He said, Alistair, you know what the word for four is in Hebrew? I said, no. He said, it's arba. You know what the word for lots in Hebrew is? It's harbe. And he said, to many of us, these two words sound similar because we think of 1, 2, 3, many. We don't like more than 3 things. Stuff breaks down. If you have an org chart where you have 3 reports and someone gets killed, it's fairly easy for other people to take that place. We optimize for resiliency over scale in that chain of command. It's a very different org chart, but they're solving for a different problem. I'll give you one more example. Consider a tower. Now, a tower that's standing very tall is stable, but it's not as stable as it could be. It could fall over in any direction under a strong wind. A tower that's lying flat has the maximum stability, but it doesn't have the ability to move in a particular direction. Traditional organizations favor the tower that's lying down with maximum stability. Agile organizations favor the tower that's standing up, ready to fall over in any direction. To me, agility is a stance. It's a position where we value adaptability over predictability. And the reason that startups are eating most enterprises' lunch is that startups were born of this agile world. They were born to find a sustainable, scalable business model, as Steve Blank said. They're bred for change. The problem here is that lean IT and the things you need to do are a threat to fat companies. Because if enterprises don't change holistically and embrace all of these components, they won't make that transition from organization to organism. And that's the real shift that we're after when we say buzzwords like agile. So when you're thinking about cloud computing, realize that you need to embrace not just clouds, but all the ancillary components that make up that organism, like agile development, like DevOps, and so on. So we have a great lineup of people to talk about this in much more depth today. Every time I look at the lineup we have here, I'm impressed, but this year is absolutely extraordinary.